Hello and welcome to Power Culture Coco, home of the Coco. I have ideas. So, we're picking up with part 2 of our conversation on the history of childcare support in America, especially in connection to women's social and economic independence, or lack thereof. So, in our last chat, links below, we talked about the successful federally subsidized, locally administered childcare centers that America set up during World War II, and then immediately dismantled post-war. And yes, America had universal childcare support that cost parents the modern equivalent of $9 to $12 per child per day to receive a standard of care that we have been falsely conditioned to believe is impossible to recreate today. As we discussed, a major motivation for defunding the childcare centers was pushing women, especially white middle-class women, out of the workforce and back into their assigned social role of dehumanized domestic appliance, whose unpaid, unsupported, and unprotected labor within the isolation of the nuclear family unit subsidized not just the lives of men, but also our state and economy at large. So the push to defund childcare centers was seen as especially necessary after women immediately outcompeted men in skilled, well-paid labor that before the war was strictly gatekept only for men, right? And that included all women, right? Black and brown women as well, who were historically relegated to domestic service work, the lowest paying and most unprotected work at the margins of society. So, you had to defund the child care to push those women out, push white women back into the home space and black and brown women out of skilled labor and back into the menial work at the margins of society. So go check out that last video if you want the full deep dive, and we're going to pick up our history today in the late 60s and early 70s. So, despite defunding those very successful childcare centers, the memory did not die. In fact, many of the children who actually attended those centers grew up to lead sustained lobbying efforts to recreate them. And their work helped usher a swell of bipartisan support for the Comprehensive Child Care and Development Act passed by Congress and vetoed by Nixon in 1971. So the CCDA, Child Care and Development Act, would have reestablished federally subsidized, locally administered childcare centers across the country with a sliding pay scale based on income. And that would mean that every American family would have access to subsidized childcare that reflected their income. How amazing does that sound? No, truly, how amazing does that sound? And it was actually genuinely a bipartisan effort, because many Republicans had not yet been radicalized against the humanity of women and children under the guise of pro-family values, which is really another way of saying patriarchal fear-mongering. So the defeat of this child care investment would become a turning point for pro-life conservatism that we see today, where it is pro-life to withhold medical care from pregnant women. And if they perish a slow, painful, preventable demise from sepsis or miscarriage, so be it. That's pro-life, baby. That's pro-life. So the CCDA was so nonpartisan that even Nixon supported it. Nixon. In fact, Nixon actually campaigned on promises to invest in federal child care support, because the science and intuitive knowledge was so clear and uncontroversial, all right? And listen, this is what we're talking about. The first 5 years of human life is really critical for brain development, okay? The quality of care, attention, and the environment that babies and children grow up in will establish the cognitive and emotional basis for the rest of their lives, okay? And this is so non-controversial that even the Princess of Wales does all of her advocacy work. Her signature issue is early years education, as in educating the public that the first 5 years of life are absolutely critical for neurodevelopment, right? And Nixon absolutely understood this. So in April 1969, he said this to Congress, quote, I don't have a good Nixon impression, so I'm not going to try. I wish I did. I just don't. In my message to Congress on February 19th on the Economic Opportunity Act, I called for a national commitment to providing all American children an opportunity for healthful and stimulating development during the first 5 years of life. I again pledge myself to that commitment. No such commitment has ever been asked in our nation. No such pledge has ever been given. We know today that the process of human development is in certain fundamental ways different from what it was thought to be. Or perhaps it is the case that mothers have always understood, but that only men have failed to notice. We have learned, first of all, that the process of learning how to learn begins very, very early in the life of the infant child. Children begin this process in the earliest months of life, long before they are anywhere near a first grade class or even a kindergarten or play school group. We have also learned that for children of the poor, this ability to learn can begin to deteriorate very early in life, so that the youths begin school well behind his contemporaries and seemingly rarely catches up. He is handicapped as surely as a child crippled by polio is handicapped, and he bears the burden of that handicap throughout all of his life. It is elemental that, even as in the case of polio, the effects of prevention are far better than the effects of the cure. And yeah, Nixon, for once, no lies detected. And it is true, in impoverished communities where all of the adults are in survival mode all of the time, just trying to keep the lights on, there is not enough extendable energy to focus on these vital investments. And that's why social infrastructure is critical. It is not a luxury. Humans are social creatures who require cooperative and reciprocal social support for optimal development. That's just the way it works. And conservatives who rally against investments in children and common sense social infrastructure try to project all sorts of complications on this very simple truth. It is common sense that it takes a village to raise a child. And a village is more than a group of people. It is a bond of common care and reciprocal investment. The village is the social investment itself. Every member contributing to the well-being and needs of every other member, right? Not for profit, but for purpose. So the CCDA was about funding the infrastructure to support the village approach at the community level. And these were not state-run care centers, very specifically not. State-funded, like federally funded, but locally created and administered by parents groups and child care experts, like at the center and helm. So the way the bill was written would allow any legitimate local organization to apply for funds. It was not limited to school boards or other politically controlled institutions. So if you got a group of parents together that wanted to do this and formed a group and had a plan, they could get it. You had a church group, you had whatever, like that's how locally controlled and parent focused this legislation was. So to understand why this bipartisan, common sense, and incredibly feasible federal investment in babies and children was vetoed by minority interests, let's listen to Hag of the Ages, Pat Buchanan, explain to us, as he was the architect.
A young conservative White House aide named Patrick Buchanan was putting a different spin on the child development bill.
I did call it the most radical piece of legislation to come out of this Congress of the United States. And we saw that over in the Soviet Union, taking kids from their parents and putting them into these institutions and having them educated there rather than at home didn't seem to me to be traditionally American.
The solution? Nixon would veto the bill, and Buchanan would write the message himself in language so strong it would not only extinguish the idea once and for all, it would electrify his right-wing base.
I said, I want to write a veto at the same time which is political and ideological and which hits the Child Development Act at its core.
And that's exactly what he did, and he hit a grand slam.
On December 9th, 1971, Nixon released his veto message.
The president says the $2 billion to have been spent on the first year for child care would be, as he put it, a long leap into the dark. One of his other
This is the heart of it.
outlined by AIDS is
For the federal government to plunge headlong financially into supporting child development would commit the vast moral authority of the national government
to the side of communal approaches to child rearing over and against the family-centered approach.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it was great.
With one stroke of the pen, President Nixon has broken his own promise to support child development, and he has greatly damaged the chances for the children of working families as well as poor children to have an opportunity for the kind of healthful and stimulating development which the president at one point in time pledged his administration to support.
The veto really did hurt. It said it was undermining the family when the family and parent role was central to everything we talked about.
Thank you very much.
It said it was going to communalize family life.
Nixon's veto message is really the first time that an American president, the leader of one of the national parties, reaches out and takes that rhetoric and nationalizes it. This rhetoric about the threat to the American family.
And suddenly, the right wing had a new and powerful organizing tool.
Yeah, so as Pat Buchanan explains, they just lied through their teeth to scare the American public out of investing in babies. They didn't actually think that those care centers were Soviet collectivization. Absolutely not. And you heard Buchanan, right? His opposition had nothing to do with the needs of kids. Nothing. It was all about his ideological preferences. Because you can't argue with these kind of investments when the intuitive understanding and the science is so radically clear. This is what's best for American children and families. And so this is actually a really good example of what I mean when I say patriarchy centers men and erases women and children as props, as resources, as non-participants. Because Buchanan's feelings, his ideologies, were more important than children's needs, since he is a man and his feelings are the word of God, apparently. And so they knew that this was nothing like forced collectivization under the Soviet Union. They were just tapping into Cold War anxieties to convince people to vote against their own best interests. They knew the bill was about putting funds in the hands of local groups run by parents, right? That was the real problem for them. Because keep in mind, this is 1971. States are still engaged in racist violence against Black people. We still have segregation fights going on, right? It's 1971. American women cannot open their own bank accounts yet without a male relative co-signing and controlling the account. They can't get credit cards. American women did not receive the right to have independent banking accounts and credit cards until 1974. Okay? But radical conservatives could see that progress on the horizon, and they were determined to stop it, even if they had to damn generations of American children to come to do so. And look at the Phyllis Schlafly. I hate her last name. I can't say it very well, so we're just going to call her Phyllis. So look at Phyllis, all right? She made a very lucrative career advocating against women. She is the one that led the charges against the Equal Rights Amendment to defeat equality for women. So the entire time she's out there having a very public, very lucrative career attacking women, saying women should stay home, women shouldn't work, while she's working and prioritizing her career. And that hag is so proud of how she stole food out of the mouths of American children. She stole attention from them, all to subjugate and force women down a path that she did not choose for herself. And we see this pattern playing out again today, right? Where you have these conservative trad wives saying, it's a trad wife lifestyle. Lady, if you are making content for profit online about being a trad wife, you're not a trad wife. You're a business owner. Stop that nonsense. Stop that mean-spirited propaganda, and stop selling out other women saying that you want them to make decisions you would never consider for yourself. Patriarchal hags, the whole lot of them, Buchanan included. All right. But they were right that defeating investments in the well-being of children was hugely successful as a conservative tool. Let's talk about why. And for that, we're going to zoom out in this conversation and talk about ideologies around childcare and welfare. Okay, so prior to the CCDA being passed by Congress, there were actually multiple bills kicking around committees to address poverty and welfare spending. And, in the 60s, we had a big rise of social experimentation and trying new federal investments for improving the quality of life and economic health of everyday Americans, from the Kennedys to Johnson's War on Poverty. So most of these efforts to combat poverty focused on welfare services, not direct economic investment in the beneficiaries. Meaning, a lot of welfare services were about social workers helping poor families secure legal services or nutritional information. It wasn't about direct resource aid. When resources were given, it was always indirectly, right? So that's how we end up with food stamps instead of cash for food. That's how we end up with housing vouchers instead of cash for housing, right? So America has traditionally set up welfare investments in that indirect way because welfare has always been viewed as transitional assistance, never envisioned as long-term investments in social infrastructure designed to meet human needs, not profit from them. So if we strip back all of the intellectualization around this belief that welfare is a temporary investment, not a necessary structure to build to help people meet needs as required by humans being social creatures, we see what they're fundamentally arguing. They are arguing that the fundamental purpose of the American government is not to provide services that facilitate humans cooperatively meeting common social needs, but that the purpose of the American government is to use violence to maintain borders and advance business interests and maintain socially established hierarchies of power. That belief that the federal government's role is not providing services can only be realized by maintaining entire classes of people who, under threat of violence, must labor to serve society instead of participating in society and being served by social structures. And there's no other way around it. The fever dream of conservative, rugged individualism needs either a trust fund or slaves to be experienced. It cannot exist on its own merit. It requires being subsidized by the subjugation or enslavement of others. And that's just the fact of it. And so historically, this was accomplished in two ways in America. First, chattel slavery. Hundreds of years of kidnapping, enslaving, and forcibly breeding black slaves, right? Like, there's no other way to sugarcoat that, okay? But also through marriage, through the domestic servitude and corresponding social death of women, the enslavement of women. Obviously, a very different type of slavery than chattel slavery. I am not comparing horrors here. It is a spectrum and they are on different spaces, but it is about the subjugation and labor theft, where you make a population support society instead of participating and being served within society. And you'll notice too that both chattel slavery and women's domestic servitude through marriage, they both rely on forced breeding, right? And let's be clear, patriarchy is about forced breeding. There is no species where all males procreate. None, not a thing. And so patriarchy was about centering men for the purpose of upending the natural order of women selecting the fittest men to procreate with. It forces women to procreate with subpar men for survival, ensuring that men do not have to develop themselves and their capacities to be attractive and selected. So upending natural selection was accomplished through a collusion of violence to hoard resources under men's exclusive control and to violently trap women to prevent them from withdrawing from that society to live in like their own women-centered groups, right? You can't have that. So marriage was invented through this process for the purpose of using hoarded resources and organized violence to purchase and trade women as property. Marriage was the institution of gendering and privatizing care work the vital work of life, as a commodity embodied by women for men to barter and consume, not participate in and contribute to. And so that's why marriage was originally a contract of sale, where a man purchased the exclusive rights and ownership of a woman. Let's be real, usually a pubescent girl, right? But he was purchasing exclusive rights to her sexual labor, her reproductive labor, her physical labor, her domestic labor, and her creative labor. So marriage was created to ensure every man could buy a woman as property, not compete and develop his skills and strength to be chosen to pass on his genes. So patriarchy is the bastardization of natural selection. And that's why, marriage is welfare for men. It's a form of male welfare, right? And it's a form of social death and social slavery for women, enforced breeding. That's the legacy there. And it's important that we talk about that here, because a byproduct of patriarchal organization is that patriarchal societies do not invest in common welfare. The state has no responsibility to provide services because society centers and serves men under the assumption that every man privately owns a woman to be his means of production, his private for-profit means of production outside of society. So it's the woman's job to do all of the important work of life, because it's women's work and obligation to meet needs without having any of her own needs be considered, right? It is her job to create life, to meet all of the needs of life, and to create quality of life without compensation, reciprocal care, or any social investment, or even an ounce of goddamn respect. It's her job to labor and labor and labor for that man so that he can consume that care work and so that society doesn't have to invest in it. It's women's job to subsidize men, to subsidize the state as enslaved laborers, not social participants who are considered and served by society. So when you have this pool of non-social private labor, for-profit labor embodied by women, well, yeah, then the state doesn't have to do shit. So social investments are only made in service of men and dominant power structures. Many of those power structures, like capitalism, abuse men too, right? Abso-freaking-lutely. But the reason that you're able to keep it going is the promise of, well, if every man gets to privately own and use a woman for his needs, his pleasure, to vent out his anger, all of that at home, well, then they're much less likely to rise up against the capitalists abusing them. They'll just transfer the abuse when they get home. That's how we keep the social order. So, and this is really clear, how systems of supremacy co-create together, right? Capitalism and patriarchy co-create together, right? So capitalism and patriarchy are co-creating there. And men will tolerate the abuse from capitalists and the state and whoever, so long as they can get a woman to use for pleasure and profit, and who cannot enact boundaries or consequences against him. That's how you maintain the hierarchy of suffering and extraction, right? And it's tolerable as long as there's someone beneath you, right? So with all of that context in mind, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, as women liberation movements and civil rights for Black people, disabled people, and everyone were winning these victories and enacting social change, of course, there would be a mandate to recalibrate our social investments. The pool of indentured labor from women and Black people no longer freely available as property for extraction. So yeah, we need to readjust our investments. You have to invest in what you were extracting before. And that's why I think childcare is such a strong representation of the nexus of all of these power struggles. It was women's job to raise children alone, outside of social support, so that she would produce fully formed adults, future workers, for the state to use and for capitalists to use, without having to invest in their development, right? Right, so this is why patriarchy is fundamentally dysfunctional, because it's about extraction, not stewardship, and eventually that will collapse on itself, okay? And so patriarchy's only really been dominant for like 5,000 years or so. During prehistory, most human societies were more matriarchally oriented, okay? And so matriarchy is not patriarchy, but with women dominating. No. Matriarchy centers family and community investments on serving the needs of babies and children and rising generations. And what's cool about that is if you have a community where all adults are cooperatively participating and contributing to the needs of all children, well, along the way, everyone's needs get met. Everyone's. It's just a beautiful byproduct, right? So the social logic of matriarchy is investing in long-term welfare, stewardship, children, everybody makes out well, okay? And so about 5,000 years ago or so, patriarchy began to rise. And so patriarchy decentered babies to forcibly and artificially center all of community and family around serving the fears and desires of adult men. Adult men. They literally are competing with babies, okay? So the revulsion around making social investments in the well-being of children through efforts like the CCDA is about adult men competing with literal babies for collective resources and benefiting from the attention and labor of women. Seriously. When social investments are made into children, it undermines patriarchal control. It undermines men's coercive control of women, of children, of society, because it undermines their leverage of controlling all resources and being exclusively centered, perpetually consuming and not contributing as men, okay? So patriarchy, no matter what, will always produce the systemic subhuman treatment of children. And that's what I mean by that is our systems treat children as the property of parents, not developing human beings and citizens with their own sets of needs and rights that society must invest in. Because patriarchy centers men, and men care about their own offspring ideally, but not somebody else's. F that kid, right? Let him rot. But even then, right, like the fatherly urge to abandon is strong. So it's really necessary for maintaining the perpetual centering of men and all control of resources with no responsibility. You have to have women isolated from each other, overburdened, overworked, and not in connection with each other, okay? That's really important. To have women isolated, overburdened, and without resources, social resources and material resources. Because when women are able to connect and raise children in community together, like the CCDA would have enabled, right? Well, that's a problem. That's a problem. You can't have women coming together, sharing their stories, finding their voice, finding their power, coming together to enact consequences for poor social behavior from men and from the state. You cannot have that. You cannot have that. And that's why patriarchy always produces the systemic subhuman treatment of children. All of our systems treat children as property of the parents, not developing human beings and young citizens with their own sets of needs and rights that society must invest in. Because patriarchy centers men, and if you invest in babies, that's not about men. That's not about men, right? And so if you want to maintain this coercive control, only centering men, the state does not make any investments in any welfare, you privately own a woman to extract that labor from. If you need to maintain that, if that's your goal, you need to keep women isolated. That's why they're so pro-nuclear family unit. Isolated, overworked, overburdened. That's how you maintain your extraction and your coercive control. So another thing that they were really going against for the CCDA is that it would fund women-based communities too much, right? Because women overwhelmingly the primary caregivers. So if you are funding community spaces that serve children, well then you're also funding spaces where women are directly connecting and forming community outside of coercive male control, outside of existing power structures. And if all those broads get talking and realize how they're all getting ripped off, Well, they might come together. They might come together and form communities that can hold men accountable, that can hold the state accountable. They can enact consequences together in power together for a lack of social investments, for a lack of male integrity, a lack of investment in women and children. You can't have that. Can't be funding that. And seriously, everything I just said is the conflict underpinning conservative opposition to investing in the CCDA and any and all forms of social infrastructure. Whatever fancy pants terms they want to throw out there, founding fathers, Soviet Union, no. This is their truth. This is their truth. The CCDA would have provided funds for any and all legitimate local organizations who requested them and were capable of effectively administering the programs. Well, you got civil rights, you have segregation fights going on, you have women's liberation movements. Like, that is against centralized control, right? Granting funds outside of state control directly to local parent groups. Well, how is the state supposed to systematically abuse Black communities if they can just get investment from the feds? How will racist school boards continue to punish Black babies for existing if they're cared for in local community groups outside of the state's reach and jurisdiction? So under these conservative worldviews, the only acceptable investment in childcare is to get single mothers off of welfare programs. And I want to talk about that a little bit, right? So some of the other bills that were being considered but did not pass at the same time as the CCDA, a lot of those bills were looking at providing subsidized childcare only to women, single mothers who were receiving welfare to get them working. And I want to look at this paradox because we constantly see this dysfunctional paradox play out, okay? The welfare program was aid to families with dependent children. And it was the most robust welfare program, and most of its recipients were single mothers. And this program was hated, and the women were demonized for being abandoned by men, right? And I want to talk about this. So post-World War II, you push women out of economic independence intentionally. You engineer a baby boom intentionally to reestablish this social order where men have a chokehold on resources and thus bear the full responsibility, essentially, of providing resources to their family, which is genuinely too much pressure, right? Genuinely too much pressure. But that was the system they intentionally created, right? That was the intentional goal of the system. Well, a byproduct of that is that that pressure providing is too much, and millions of men shit the bed and just abandoned their families, okay? Millions of men shit the bed, abandoned their wife, abandoned their children, went to F off and do whatever, pleasure seeking. So then you have all of these single mothers within the system that you created. Well, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? So they had to go through these welfare programs, right? And then they're demonized. They're hated. And oh my gosh, in some of the papers I was reading, researching this, more than one openly said, well, if a woman can't take care of herself, she can hardly be expected to take care of children. Academic papers talking about the connection between welfare and childcare in America. I wanted to vomit. At no point were they talking about deadbeat men who assume full control, can't handle the responsibility, shit the bed, and abandon. No, can't talk about them. Can't talk about them. We got to demonize the women who stayed, who had the strength to stay and nurture their children under impossible circumstances. But we can't talk about those deadbeat men. No. And so that's all about, and it's just rank misogyny, right? It's about scapegoating women for the failures of patriarchal systems and the failures of men who cannot deal with the amount of control and power they are demanding. They cannot responsibly fulfill the role. And it is too much pressure. It is too much pressure to have that chokehold. But you have to make choices. You have to make choices. If this is the system that you demand, well, then we need social safety nets for when men shit the bed and abandon their families. That's it. And listen, that's the natural result of the systems they fought for. When you fight to provide male welfare, ensuring men control resources by forcing women out of the public workforce, by forcing women into the margins, not allowing women to perform well-paid skilled labor, or by artificially paying men more for the same labor or subpar performance of the same roles, these are all forms of male welfare. And the natural result of chronic male welfare is failure, because the foundations are rotted. When you engineer male welfare and male supremacy like that to ensure men have control but no responsibility, you create like this fragile ass chokehold. And when that man shits the bed, and we're just supposed to blame women for the natural results of this dysfunctional system. We just blame women. And listen, we see this stigmatization playing out today. A delusional denial of the natural results of the beliefs and systems that conservatives advocate for. Republicans want more babies. They want more stay-at-home moms. No-fault divorce needs to be repealed. Heck, some guys are actually talking about repealing the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women's right to vote. Look at this jerk.
In a nutshell, in general, I don't want to see women in the public sphere. You mean they shouldn't hold political office? Correct. You mean you don't want to see them podcasting? Correct. Well, but what about in the marketplace, with, 9 to 5, careers? No, not that either. Like, I don't want to see women holding positions in the public square. I don't.
Yeah, so they want to push women out of public life completely, but also men need to go 50-50. They need total submission. So women need to obey and submit, but also lead, because he doesn't know what to do if she doesn't tell him exactly. But he's leading, don't forget that. But he can't provide 50-50. It has to be a split. So she needs to work full time and raise babies at home and be a trad wife who cooks 3 meals a day from scratch. And she needs to be soft. No masculinity, no masculine women. No one wants that. No one wants a woman who takes charge. And also don't forget, he needs to feel needed. Don't nag him though. Don't nag him though, because he needs to feel like a man. So you need to make this man feel needed, feel like a man. You need to go 50-50, be a trad wife, subsidize him and obey, but he can't know what to do if you don't write him a list and hold his hand and kiss his head when he messes up. Yeah, no problem, boys. And it's all nonsense. It all stems from patriarchal impoverishment of masculinity that occurs through generations of male welfare, through generations of forced breeding by entitlement, through forced marriage, through generations of centering men and no one else. All of these structures of male welfare that gave them control, they have not developed the strength or capacity to be responsible for. So I'm going to quote from that academic paper again. The current interest in childcare did not spring from the wish of middle-class women to participate in the workforce. Rather, it started as a way to ensure that poor women could labor at jobs the richer women would have disdained. Neither did childcare sprout from women's liberation, but it did develop from the need to have poor women work. The government gets the benefit of their work as well as relief from the liability of welfare payments. This is the tradition of childcare in America. Now, I'm going to close this out with a gem of a quote that I found in the Nixon presidential records at the University of Virginia. So this was like a memo summary of his day. Quote, "The president registers his opposition to legislation that would fund child development centers across America, then expresses his support of the brutal military dictatorship of Emilio Garcilaso Medici in Brazil." All in a day's work, am I right? Supporting military dictatorships in Brazil, terrorizing women and children at home. No funds for babies, but yo, if you have an authoritarian that wants to terrorize his own population, we got plenty of money for bombs. All in a day's work. I mean, Nixon must have been on ice baths, right? Like that's a lot of harm to cause across the hemisphere in one day. He must have taken an ice bath after that, right? Because that's male accountability. should we take away from all of this, Coco? We should take away that we are absolutely capable of making federal investments for locally run community childcare support. We deserve it. It's what's best for kids. It's what's best for women. It's what's best for men. It's what's best for society. We can do it. All families and people of all stripes and configurations will benefit from making these critical investments in the future of America. And so I speak to this history not to dishearten us, but to stoke our imaginations of the better future that we can and will create together, that we must create together. Fascists and patriarchal people are not going to win the future, all right? They're not. The next few years, absolutely a rough ride. I'm not going to share rough. But the only silver lining is that from all of their destruction and incompetence and malice, is that on the other side of them making everything fall apart, we get to rebuild, and we get to rebuild right. So let's tax the billionaires out of existence. Let's make massive investments in community prosperity and creating spaces of purpose, not profit. And we can do this. I speak to hold this vision for us, for what we can fight for, what we deserve, and what we are capable of. So never let those spiteful hags try to dim the imagination of what we know is possible and what we know is worth fighting for. So thank you so much. I'm Power Culture Coco. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for weekly videos. Listen, I am off next week. I'm traveling across country. I'm really excited. I'm actually moving, and it's very cool. But I'll be off for a week as I will be hauling it across the states. But if you want to keep up with my journey, I will be posting all of it over at TikTok, Coco Has Ideas, and Instagram, Paraculture Coco, and then the YouTube Reelsies. Shorts. I think they call it shorts. My bad. Eat my shorts. Anyway, I always love hearing from you, so please drop a line in the comments. Let me know your thoughts, how this resonated with you, and I'll talk to you guys again very soon.